So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Confidence for Translation 2024 Information Workshop. My name is Alessandro. I'm Translational Research Manager at the university, where I manage Translation Manchester together with Ellie Marinopoulou, also on the call today. Translation Manchester is coordinating this Confidence for Translation call. Together with us is also Dr. Sam Butterworth. Sam is the academic lead for the MRC Impact Accelerator account that funds this call. Very briefly, the agenda for today is a brief introduction to the Confidence for Translation scheme, including the timelines. Then Sam will give some top tips, do's and don'ts, and some advice really on how to build a strong funding application. Finally, we will briefly cover the new costing process. And hopefully we will leave enough time for you to ask any questions on the call and on the application form. If you have any, we can answer question on eligibility, specific question. We can provide clarity on specific question on the application form. We also have colleagues from the Innovation Factory and Research Services. We have Shalini from the Innovation Factory and Connie from Research Services, who will be able to provide some answer on the costing process and intellectual property if needed. The meeting is being recorded and we'll post it online together with the slides at the end. In order to ask the question, you can use the chat. Please do that. Feel free to do that whilst we're talking or after we finish. We can also raise your hand at the end and we can, Sam will chair the question and answer session. So without further ado, let's start with a bit of background and introduction on the scheme. So this is the 2024 call of our main flagship Confidence for Translation scheme. It is essentially a proof of concept scheme which is designed to help researchers to unlock specific bottlenecks that are stopping the projects to progress along the translational pipeline. It's really meant to de-risk projects with a view enabling them to go and apply and obtain external follow-on funding. We're looking mostly at projects that fit within four categories broadly, which is therapeutics, diagnostic, digital intervention, and devices. We accept application from project at any stage of the translational pipeline, from proof of concept to later stages involving clinical investigation. It is very important to highlight in your application, and I'm sure Sam will go through that in a minute, how the funding will help you progress into that translational pipeline closer to patient benefit. This call in particular is mostly funded by the MRC Impact Accelerator account with some contribution from Wellcome and the BRC. And in terms of remit, we do ask you if your research aligns with the priorities of those funders. However, this will not influence the chances of success. What you need to show is that your research addresses an unmet clinical need. And again, Sam will go into more details about that in a minute. We would be expecting projects to last between 6 to 9 months, although we do accept projects up to 12 months in duration. And normally, the costs that you would be requesting are a PDRA, a research technician with some consumables. However, there is flexibility with this. In fact, this year, we also accept application for you to access external expertise, such as a consultant, a research nurse, or things like that, similarly to what we used to do with our access to expertise scheme up until last year. In terms of timelines, the call is now open. The deadline is the 10th of July. So this year, this is a single stage application process. So this is different from previous years. We're going to conduct the peer review over the summer with the panel meeting starting in September, being held in September, and the project starting shortly after. So we will notify applicants of the outcomes in October time, with projects starting after that. So I think I covered most of the things I wanted to cover, and I can now hand over to Sam for the do's and don'ts and some top tips. Sam.
Great, thank you very much, Alessandro. Yeah, so I guess just to reiterate that point from Alessandro, so because of the election, the MRC extended the IAA by 1 year, and it took them a long time to confirm the budget we had available for that. So so this call is predominantly funded by that extension. And as a result of the time it took to confirm the budget, we've had to reduce this to a single round in order to get the applications processed in time. Previously, we would have had a slightly shorter EOI. That makes this section even more important this year, because previously, if a project came in that looked good, but perhaps some of the edges were a bit rough, we could put it through with some feedback and people could try and address that in the full application. This time, you're only going to get one shot at getting that story right and making sure that the panel is convinced that this is a project that needs to be funded. And of course, ultimately, you know, we'd love to fund all of the projects, but we don't have enough money to. So we have to attempt to apply some kind of quality threshold to fund the projects we think are going to have the most, you know, the most potential impact from this funding. So yeah, so really, projects that apply here have to be addressing some kind of unmet clinical need. You have to have a clear understanding of what your thing, whether that's a new therapeutic agent, a new diagnostic, a new device, or a new digital health intervention, what unmet need is that going to address that's going to improve outcomes for patients if this project is ultimately, you know, successfully translated. So that means you need to really understand the current landscape. If you come in and don't really understand clinically how your application could be applied and what is being done currently, then it's likely that will be picked up on by the panel. And one way to do that is to have, you know, clinical co-investigators, if you have access to them, who can provide that kind of input for you if you need that, if you're coming from a more basic science angle. And an important point to point out there is, you know, a lot of us, myself included, are often working on quite early stage projects where actually that ultimate clinical application maybe isn't fully defined, and there could be multiple potential patient populations where this approach could be applied. Fundamentally, you do not have space to sell more than one idea in this application, right? So it's great if there is possibly more applications of your technology than the one you're proposing to address here. But you just don't have the word count to tell a convincing story over more than one. So you have to pick your best application now and think about, you know, as we come on to the other top tips, making sure that the application you pick aligns, you know, to one way you can tell as clear a story of how this is going to be used as possible. And that's true here. You'll find that's also true in larger translation applications. Even when you come to DPFS, you don't actually get that many more words to sell your concept. It's always very difficult to sell broad things in these kind of applications. Right. Next slide, please, Alessandro. So what we're really looking for here, you know, in almost no cases is £75,000 going to be enough to fund a full project, right? We are aware that this is a piece of funding that can address one, really maybe two key problems that you have in a project. And so the purpose of these awards from MRC's perspective is to effectively de-risk projects with small targeted studies that address what we call these key hurdles, which, if they were to fail, would derail the project, and if they were to succeed, would really strengthen the proof of concept. So that these projects are then ready to achieve follow-on funding. So our main metric really from these projects is not publications, it's our projects progressing to the additional funding they're going to need to be translated. So how do you identify these key hurdles? So there's lots of ways of thinking about this. I mean, one way is, what is the most awkward question that you could be asked? What's the thing in the project that you think, okay, if that's the thing that I'm really hoping the reviewers don't spot, or that's the bit of information we really don't have that is going to make a big difference. Thinking about that, you can think about how that fits into the kind of the line of sight to patients. If what is going to have to happen for this technology to ultimately be applied in patients, and what are the stages I'm going to have to go through, and which are the ones of those that have the highest risk associated with them. So if the proposal doesn't address risk, it's unlikely to be looked on that favorably by the panel. So what does that mean? That means if this is a piece of work that could just be the first part of the next application, and there's no real prospect of it failing, then it should be the first part of your next application, right? You're not going to actually improve the fundability of your next application by doing this. That doesn't mean those aren't useful things to progress the projects. And there is obviously a bit of a gray area there. But like, I mean, I'm struggling to pick a perfect example of this. So I'll just come up with something that's a half decent example. Converting something into an app, for example, that is already working in one form and you now need it to be an app. Well, you kind of know that's going to work, right? You need to do it. It needs to be done. But ultimately, the project is going to, you're not really going to be at any lower risk. You're just going to be further along the path if you successfully achieve that. So that doesn't mean we don't fund app-based work, but just you need to think about why this is a key thing that has to be done in order to enable follow-on funding, and you need to sell that very clearly to the reviewers. Next page, please. So, some of the best applications often are actually ones where they have been to DPFS or some other downstream funder, and they've had the feedback that says, yeah, we really like this, but you need to show this first. So if you have engaged with any downstream funders, whether that's commercial funders, VCs, it could be with the Innovation Factory, or ideally, external funding bodies like, for example, the MRC DPFS. And you've got that feedback, tell us, use that to structure your application and what you're doing. You have to have freedom to exploit your innovation. So these innovations do not have to be commercially viable, but they do have to be translatable. And there have to be no barriers to the translation of those. I mean, obviously there's going to be barriers, but no kind of red flag barriers. So trying to develop a drug that you don't have any ownership of, for example, I mean, you might get some lovely data, but if the company who owns that drug don't want to collaborate with you, your data might not be worth anything, unless maybe it's an area where there are 10 of those drugs, in which case you're just using this one as a model, that might be okay. So thinking about making sure you have that freedom to operate and to move forwards. And you'll need to speak to the Innovation Factory and look hard at the licenses, etc., if that's not the case. That can work with companies, but we can also sometimes see that with academic collaborations. I'm collaborating with this academic in Edinburgh. They have this technology. We're going to try and apply it here. What do you have that confirms that the group in Edinburgh are going to continue to work with you if that's successful? Because again, you might generate loads of lovely data and then decide actually they're not interested anymore. So please try and think about that. The panel are all people with sort of translational research expertise, all from scientific backgrounds, covering the range of sort of areas we fund, but none of them are going to be specialists in your field. So be very careful about getting into very technical language around what you're trying to achieve here. You need enough detail that someone can understand it, but it has to be written for a kind of a competent non-specialist rather than a specialist audience. So that can be a slight issue with some applications. Obviously you need to sell your idea. If you've got data that supports what you've done so far, hopefully you will do, then sharing that data is great. I think sometimes we see applications that sort of oversell their data, and there's nothing worse than looking at a project you think is really exciting and then getting to the data page and going, oh, that wasn't quite what I was expecting, kind of thing. So make sure you don't oversell your what you can do with your project, because it will almost certainly be picked up on by the reviewers. Next slide, please. So a good proposal will have identified a really clear bottleneck or hurdle and convince the panel that bottleneck can be addressed. It should be addressed, and it can be addressed with the funding. And that in addressing that, you will move the project, significantly along the translational pathway, or at least address a very clear risk that the project is carrying at this point. We'd like to see clear and specific objectives. How will you know you've been successful? And associated milestones. We don't really hold people to those milestones, but that milestone-based thinking will be really helpful in showing the panel that you understand what you're doing, why you're doing it in this order, and what you have to achieve in order to be successful. We want to see a clear plan for follow-on funding. So what are you going to do with this? Like I said, you're not going to finish your project with £75,000. You need to have clarity on the IP situation. Like I've said, Make sure you've got the right people in the application, whether that's internal or external experts. As Alessandro said, we're very happy for people to bring in external expertise where that knowledge isn't available within the team. And make sure you've got all the licenses in place, and ethics as well. So if your proposal requires ethics and that ethics is not in place currently, then that is okay, but you need to have a really clear idea of how you're going to approach that. One of the biggest fail points and delays we see in projects are projects coming in that need ethics, or people don't have it. And just putting no when you have a project that probably does need ethics is not a good outcome, because that will again be picked up on by the reviewers. So next. So obviously these projects have to have a clear translational focus. As I mentioned, we know that the panel of reviewers are not super specialists, but we do need to have a sufficient technical data to understand how your technology is going to be applied. Making sure you have the right expertise in the team is critical. Making sure where sampling and study, like you're dealing with, for example, a patient sample or animal numbers in an in vivo study, etc. Make sure that the design of those studies and the sample sizes are fully justified. If they're not, we will have a statistician as part of the review panel, and if they don't believe the sample size is credible to achieve the outcomes you need to achieve, that will be picked up on. Make sure everything is clearly justified, of course. Make sure you include sensible and measurable milestones, so you can demonstrate you've been successful. And this is a really important one. The last one is make sure you understand your technology and how it fits with other competing solutions that are out there, or at a similar or more advanced development stage. We see often quite a few applications that have just attempted to disregard this, and it can be particularly problematic, especially in areas where there's a lot of activity at the moment, like in the sort of digital health space, etc. What actually differentiates your things from things that are out there. The reviewers are likely to have a look, and if they find that what you're doing is very, very similar to something that is already being done by a company that's 5 years ahead of you, you may have a reason why your approach is much better, but you have to address and explain that to us. If you pretend there's nothing else going on in this space, it's likely to be picked up and obviously won't be looked on very favorably by the panel. And that happens surprisingly often, right? It seems like maybe an obvious thing to say, but it's not an unusual thing to pick up in applications. I think that's the end of my section, is it, Alessandro? Yeah, so I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sam. So in this slide really is about summarizing what we have already mentioned, really. So as Sam said, we will need, and that's what we would like to see in the application form. So what the underpinning problem is, what the clinical need is, where are you now, and what bottleneck you are experiencing, what specifically this project will achieve, where will it move you, and the alternative solution, that's what Sam just mentioned, and what the risk are. We also have a question on risks and mitigation, so you'll have a chance to explain that. And then finally, the long-term translational plan. So we're not going to go through the application form question by question, although we are happy to answer a question about that. However, with the slides that will be circulated after the meeting, you'll see where we would expect to see this information. So that is it's not going to be circulated actually because we don't have your contact details, but it's going to be uploaded on the website at the page that you reach the Zoom link from. So in terms of the last couple of slides, we wanted to give you a little bit of background on the new costing process. So from this year, we actually do not request full economic costing for this proposal. And this is with a view of reducing administrative burden and also like streamlining the application process a little bit. So we do not require you to reach out to research services to cost the application. However, we do still need some costings in order to review the proposal and expect the expenditure. So we're asking you to cost this through the research costing tool, BlackTackle. and not to contact research services. So information on how to use BlackDuckle are in the application brief and FAQs documents. Those are accessible from our website. Again, also, you can ask questions today, and we also have a dedicated costing workshop for C4T application on the 25th of June with our colleague Connie, who is on the call today. So really, this is about you calculating direct link costs, but also provide information that is needed in order to do the full economic costings if your project is successful. So at post-award level, research services will look at that budget costing sheet, which looks like this. And they will take the project ID, budget ID, which you will have provided from BlackDuckle, and also the information about the FTE or from PIs and COIs to calculate the full economic costing only on the projects that are successfully awarded. Another difference from this year is that you will not be required to seek head of school approval before you submit this proposal. The head of schools will be notified of successful projects after the panel meetings, but you do not need to seek their approval before submitting. So this way, we're hoping that we streamline the application process because you don't need to wait for up to 4 weeks for the full economic cost, and you don't need to seek head of school approval before you submit your application. I think we covered most of the things that we wanted to cover, and we can open the floor for questions. And I'll hand it back to you, Sam, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. So if you have any questions, you're very welcome to come off mute and ask them, or raise your hand, or you can put them into chat. If you have any concerns about anonymity or anything, if you put a question into chat, that won't be recorded, although people here will see that you've asked.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, thank you very much for the information. Could I ask who is eligible to apply as the PI? Could postdocs apply as well, or?
I can't remember what the rules are for that, Alessandro. Can you remember?
Yeah, so postdoc are eligible to apply. They would need to have their contract that goes for the duration of the proposed projects. And the only limitation there, if they need to have a co-I with like the senior guarantor. And also the only issue is that they will not be able to ask for their own salary within the costing, because we only fund directly incur costs only. So if they were to need their salary to be covered by the application, they cannot be the main PI. They can still be a co-I, but the PI will have to be the current line manager. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
And I think that also answers Millie's question in chat. So yeah, postdoc salary is eligible for postdocs on the award. You can either have named postdocs or open postdoc positions. Obviously, there'd be a slight preference for named postdocs just in terms of the recruitment of postdocs. These short posts can be challenging, but we will fund projects that have open postdoc positions on them if everything else about that project is really strong. Right, I'll come back. I think James had the hand up first.
Yeah, so I work for Manchester University Foundation Trust. Do we have to have a university employee involved, or can we apply?
Again, Alessandro, I might have to bump that one back to you, sorry.
That's fine. Actually, the slide I just put on, I don't know if you can see, but that answered the previous question and this question. So we do accept application from people with honorary contracts at the university. So I'm not sure if that fits your eligibility, James. So they will need to have some links with the universities. They will have to be honorary. And if they don't, we do also accept application from someone that has got a plan to become honorary, but because the final award will sit within the University of Manchester, it has to align with our infrastructure. So we wouldn't accept an application if there was no links with the university, and that should be the PI. And if they're honorary but not honorary yet, with the honorary contract being in progress, then we will need a co-I at the university, which will actually be the award holder until the honorary position is sorted. Does that answer your question, James?
Yeah, thanks.
And Richard, we come to you.
Hi, thanks for the information. I was wondering, the bottleneck I have is I need to get a kind of in silico drug discovery pipeline run through a CRO, and I don't know, is it within the C4T's remit to have a CRO that just you're basically paying them to do something? They've told me they'll take 3 months, they'll come back, then I can do a screen of the compounds they send me. Is that the kind of sort of application that would be, seen as favorable by the review panel? Because I know obviously that the company aren't going to give me anything back. It's simply a contract where I get them to do something I can't do. And to be honest, it's felt quite hard to do in an academic setting. But the idea is that if I get that process through and get some really successful hits, which one of my collaborators has done in the past, that will then set me up for Innovate UK, DBFS sort of application in the future. But obviously this is a contract with a company that's outside of the university. Is that valid under this C4T application?
Yeah, and that aligns to a little bit of one of the other questions in the chat about external partners. It's 100% fine to use external partners to deliver your project, whether that's CROs or other collaborators under appropriate agreements, right? The IP agreement would have to give you freedom to operate moving forwards. But yeah, I think we funded entirely outsourced projects in the past. I mean, to some extent, they're favorable because the delivery risk is actually often lower for those than it is for if you need to recruit a postdoc or whatever. So I don't think there's any challenge with doing that. In terms of your specific question, that is a project that would be definitely within remit. I think you will have the challenge, unfortunately. We could maybe pick this up offline around whether that project is going to be too early relative to others when we come to making the final hard funding decision. And not that we wouldn't want to fund it, but ultimately, it's very high risk versus something where maybe we have a bit more security of delivery and making sure we're balancing that across the projects we fund, right? Because we want projects to be risky and we want projects to fail. Otherwise, we're not funding the right things. But equally, we have to have a balance. We can't have everything fail and then turn around to the MRC and say we don't have any projects that have gone forwards. So it's we do see those early stage projects. They do get funded, but I think it's probably a harder space to be applying in. But let's pick that up offline more specifically about your project. Yeah, but in terms of remit and how you're going to spend the money, it sounds completely fine. Yeah. So is there anywhere where we can see successful applications? That is a good point. I don't think we've ever been asked that before, and we've never done it. Obviously there are external, the university does hold successful grant repositories for external funders. I think so. The answer to that, Kate, is no, but it's something we should pick up offline to see whether it's something we can do. It would obviously need the PIs to like when you have a successful external grant, you can put it into the grant repository or whatever it's called. We would need to ask some of the previously successful applicants if they were happy to share them. It's a good idea, though. Actually, I don't know why we haven't been asked that before in all the years we've been doing this. So thank you. Katie's question: developing methodology that's at the start of the translational pathway, but more methodology based. So this is a really interesting question. So if you look, so we tend to be led by the DPFS remit because ultimately that's what MRC are giving us this money for, is to fund projects that are going to go forwards to DPFS. And so for the MRC component, well, when we had welcome funding as well, it was a bit different. But for the MRC component, we tend to be led by the DPFS remit. And if you look, the DPFS remit does now cover technologies as well as specific applications. So enabling technologies are covered by the DPFS. I'm now on the panel for DPFS, and so far I've never seen one come through as an application, which is interesting. So it's in the remit, but people aren't really applying to DPFS at the moment to do that. So I would say from what you've written there, it sounds like it's been remit, Katie, but I think you might have to think quite hard about how you're going to sell that as in terms of the ultimate application.
Okay. I'll just come off mute. Is it worth us having a chat offline about that?
I was going to say exactly that. Maybe we should have a quick chat. Obviously, we've sort of had it before, so I know. Just send me an email and we can maybe have a chat. I probably a bit like the last one. I think we'll probably reach a conclusion it's in remit, but my instinct is when it comes through to the panel, it's going to be hard to elevate it up past projects that look closer to application, if that makes sense. So let's have a chat about it and see whether we can, because I think remit wise it should be in. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sam, can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's probably a very similar question. So I'm thinking of a project that is a really pilot project. We have data in one setting and we want to see whether this data is reproducible in a slightly different setting. However, we're also aware that there is a risk that this is not the case. So I'm wondering, in the application, do we need to have a plan B to use the money? Because it's a kind of a stepwise pilot project, and if the first step of the project fails, we won't be able to progress to the second step. So do we need to have a plan B?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, you don't really have a lot of space for a plan B, although you could include a fallback option. We have seen this before, where there's an application that comes through where it's actually just the first couple of months that are going to torpedo the whole project, not necessarily the first year.
Exactly.
I mean, in an ideal world, the answer to that would be apply for the funding for that key. If that's the key hurdle, getting that initial data, and you're going to be able to get to that answer in a couple of months, then apply for the funding you need to ask that question, and then you can come back and apply for more funding if that needs follow up, or you could include a milestone. Now, in practice, that makes in theory, that makes perfect sense. In practice, obviously, that then gets complicated in terms of if that needs a postdoc, how are you going to get a postdoc onto a contract if you're not sure if that contract's going to be 1 month or 3 months or 12 months, etc. And in which case, having some fallback options, if the answer is no from the first one, would probably be a good idea, if that's the sort of thing it needs. The very best solution to that problem would be to just ask for the money you need to get you through that first big risk, right? That's the cleanest way out of that, if you can work out a way of configuring it that way.
So through the same application. So I mean, can I ask for less money, in other words?
Yeah. Ask for as little. Ask for the amount of money you need to ask the question, right? If it looks like the projects are padded out too much, then that's good. We as with all panels, the only advantage of being cheaper is if you're around the thresholds, that might get you, and we're around the budget threshold, that might get you above the line rather than a more expensive project that might be below. If the project looks like reasonable value for money and the costs are justified, we don't include the costs as a ranking, but it might help you in that final flow. But equally, if the project doesn't look well justified, or the risk looks too high in the first round, and I can remember one, it was in exactly that position a couple of years ago, that ultimately wasn't funded because we're like, well, what happens after 2 weeks when this hasn't worked, right? What do we do then?
Correct.
And so a small, more targeted award. I mean, there is still the possibility as well, I don't know, Alessandro, for some flex funding as well, etc. So it might be actually, if you do have a really early fail point, it may be actually there's ways to support you to get that preliminary data outside of this scheme even.
Through another scheme? Through a separate call, sorry.
So is the flex funding still open, Alessandro? Is it open in perpetuity, or is it closed now?
So we normally close it around the funding calls, because the main purpose is to fund beyond the limit of the main calls. So I think for the time being, I would consider that closed.
Okay. In which case, then I would put in what you think is the application for the funding you need to address the key risk in your project, and
Okay.
I would be wary of a project plan that looks like it could fail in the first month, and then you don't really know what you're going to do. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So probably the best thing to do is to apply basically for less money, and if he's successful, to go for a separate call at a later stage rather than going for the full project knowing that there is a risk.
Yeah, if you can configure the project that way, that would probably play best with the panel, I would expect. Yeah.
Okay.
So much
Perfect. Thank you.
based on what's there now. Cool. So right, let's come back to here. Does the PROS project have to have a commercialization NP goal? So the answer to that is no. You don't need to have. There doesn't need to be a commercial outcome from your project, but it does need to be translatable. So in some contexts, it's very hard to develop a plan for taking a drug through to real impact if at no point it's going to be commercialized. For example, if you're trying to develop a new drug, no one is going to spend the billions of dollars need to take a new molecule through clinical trials if there's no financial endpoint. That's just the reality of the modern world, unfortunately. If you are repositioning a drug, which could go directly into a clinical trial, and there is a credible funding pathway to get that through to patients and proof of concept, for example, using NIHL funding or similar, then that is 100% fine. Just make sure you're very clear on why the profile of the drug that you're repurposing is suitable for the application you're going in. So, for example, telling us a drug that achieves total exposure in humans of a few nanomolar has some biological activity at 10 micromolar in your assay is unlikely to get anyone very excited. So you need to be able to really clearly show that this drug, either based on clinical data or based on compelling preclinical data, has a repurposable profile in the indication you want to look at. Yeah. Hopefully that answers that question. There was another question, a direct message about follow-up calls, etc. So if you want to follow up on anything about specific projects, what we would ask you to do is email the Translation at Manchester team in the first instance, and they will either address that themselves, or if it requires my input, they'll funnel it through to me. If we can address that by email, great. If we need to arrange a few meetings with a few people, if it's absolutely essential, we can probably try and do that. Unfortunately, we're all super busy, so we probably can't meet every applicant, but we'll try and make sure we can give you as clear advice as possible, and certainly, we want to support people to put in really good applications that do their project justice. So we'll do our best to help. Great. I think we seem to have completed all the questions from the chat. So I'll just hand back to Alessandra at the end. So there's another one of these calls next week. So if you come up with a burning question and want to join again, you're obviously very welcome. But as I said before, anything else, if you contact through to the Translation at Manchester address, and we will try and address those questions between us, give you as much clarity as possible. If not, hopefully this has been useful, and you can start to think about how your sort of project proposals can align to the scheme. Have a look through the questions. It will be difficult to say everything that you want to say in the word count you're allocated. That's always the fun of writing grant applications. But hopefully this has given you some idea of where to really focus your efforts. And yeah, we hope to see some really exciting applications through from you all. Great. Alessandra, is there anything else you want to say before we close?
No, I think that was perfect. Thank you so much, Stan, for your expertise as well. And we look forward to receive everyone's applications in July. Thank you for coming.
Great. Thank you, everyone.